On January 6th of 2017, a 26-year-old man took a flight from Anchorage, Alaska to Fort Lauderdale with evil on his mind. After getting off of the plane and going to the baggage area, what he would do next was absolutely sickening. This is the Fort Lauderdale Airport Massacre. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also crime that just so happens to be true. Think about that one. But anyway, today we're going over a relatively uncovered case involving a deranged man with red flags that should have hurt him, but didn't. Esteban Santiago Ruiz was born on March 16th of 1990 in New Jersey, the United States. His family is Puerto Rican, but they lived in New Jersey until Esteban was about 2 years old. They then moved back to Puerto Rico, and specifically to a small town. Esteban was not an only child. He did have a couple of siblings, and he had a pretty big family. While growing up, he was seen as normal, but very serious and quiet. There's not a crazy amount of information about his upbringing, but we do know that he went to school in Puerto Rico and would eventually graduate. At the age of 17, on December 14th of 2007, Esteban enlisted in the Puerto Rico National Guard. From April of 2008 to November of 2008, he was then 18, and his assignment was to be attached to a guard unit during this time to learn more about that world. From November of 2008 to March of 2009, Esteban went to Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri for basic and engineer training. From March of 2009 until March of 2010, Esteban went back to Puerto Rico to serve in the National Guard, specifically as a combat engineer, MOS 12B. This position would have him skilled in tasks such as clearing minefields, demolitions, and also building bridges, roads, fences, etc. Now, on April 23rd of 2010, Esteban would be deployed out to Iraq to help serve in the war until February 19th of 2011. At the time, he was with the 130th Engineer Battalion / the 1013th Engineer Company Sappers out of Aguadilla. Esteban would get deployed to Balad, Iraq, and for the most part, he spent his time helping to clear roads of any improvised explosives and maintained bridges. From day to day, he'd ride in armored trucks and use detection equipment to try and find fires or trash piles or things that indicated hidden bombs. Sometimes they would dismount and investigate suspicious spots, and the entire time, the whole battalion was always stressed out. And do you want to know what stressed me out? At the beginning of last year, totally out of nowhere and right after the holidays, I woke up with this wild pain shooting through my arm. At first, it was just this weird ache in my forearm, but by that evening, the pain had crept all the way into my shoulder. The next morning, it got so intense, I couldn't even move my arm without nearly crying. I couldn't lift anything, I could barely get dressed, and every tiny motion felt like someone was twisting something inside of my muscles. I realized I needed to see a doctor immediately, and that's where the sponsor of today's video comes in. ZocDoc is a free app and website that makes finding a doctor straightforward. You can search for and compare quality in-network doctors, select one that fits your needs, and book an appointment with just a click. They've got over 100,000 healthcare providers lined up, covering everything from mental health to dental, eye care to skincare, and more. You can filter for doctors who accept your insurance, are nearby, suit your specific medical needs, and have great ratings from verified patients. You'll also see their available appointment times, so you can pick what works for you and lock it in instantly. Plus, ZocDoc gets you in fast, typically within 24 to 72 hours, and sometimes even the same day. So no more excuses for skipping those doctor visits. Head to ZocDoc.com/hightimecrime to find and book a highly rated doctor today. It's that simple. Thank you again to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video. But coming back to, these guys were stressed out all of the time. At any given time, they could be attacked or accidentally trip a hidden bomb. Several months after being deployed, on January 2nd of 2011, two soldiers from Esteban's unit, Sergeant Jose Citron Rosado, who was 38, and Specialist Jose Delgado Arroyo, who was 41, were killed by a roadside bomb just near Taji. These two men were considered the older, father figure type of soldiers in their company, and their deaths were a huge hit for everyone, especially Esteban. A month and a couple of weeks later, on February 19th of 2011, Esteban finished his deployment in Iraq, and when he came back, he was never the same. According to his family, he came back a different person, that he came back with visions and very bad psychological problems, but that he was proud of his service and appeared calm. Also, according to his ex-girlfriend, he tried to get help after this from higher-ups, but was never given any. Esteban received a lot of medals and awards for his time in Iraq and the Guard, and these were the Army Commendation Medal, the Army Good Conduct Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, the Iraq Campaign Medal and Campaign Star, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, the Armed Forces Reserve Medal with M device, the Army Service Ribbon, the Overseas Service Ribbon, the Combat Action Badge, and the Driver and Mechanic Badge for wheeled vehicles. Esteban was a relatively decorated soldier. In 2012, for some reason, the local Puerto police investigated Esteban for erratic behavior, and they confiscated his firearms in March of 2012. They returned these firearms 2 years later in May of 2014. Not only this, but also in 2012, Esteban somehow obtained a Florida driver's license even though he never lived in Florida. And he was able to use this ID to get a concealable carry permit application in Puerto Rico. I genuinely have no idea how that was allowed or how he even did that because he never had a permanent address in Florida and there was zero record of him living there. I do know that he had half-brothers who lived there, so perhaps some loophole happened. But Esteban, I believe after getting his guns returned in 2014, decided to leave the Puerto Rico Guard and randomly moved to Alaska with his brother to get a fresh start, and they moved into a trailer together. Some articles say it was because of work opportunity, and that could be true too. But on November 21st of 2014, Esteban would join the Alaska Army National Guard as a combat engineer. He got stationed at the armory on Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. It was very close to Anchorage. For this position, Esteban was a traditional soldier, and he would usually go to work for the Guard for 1 weekend a month and a 2-week period for training. Now, during Esteban's time doing this, he did a horrible job and he was demoted. He also had multiple unexplained absences, and this got him a label of unsatisfactory performance. On August 16th of 2016, Esteban was given a general discharge from the Alaska Army National Guard, and his rank at the time was an E3 Private First Class. So going back just a bit though, sometime in 2014 or 2015, Esteban, who was 25, would start dating a 40-year-old woman named Gina. Gina, before meeting Esteban, lived in Bird Creek, just south of Anchorage, and she ran a birdhouse garage with her husband at the time and kept animals on their property. Eventually, they would divorce, and after that, Gina moved to Anchorage with, I believe, her 2 or 4 children. I know they had 4 children, but I don't know if they split them. Somehow, in some way, Esteban would meet Gina, and somehow, some way, these two managed to hit it off very well. So well to the point that Esteban would actually move in with Gina and her children and get into a very serious relationship. But it's clear that Esteban wasn't a good person, and a lot of things prove this. On January 10th of 2016, at their home in Anchorage, Gina was in the bathroom on the toilet when Esteban started to yell at her. I don't know what it was about, but Gina locked herself into the bathroom, and Esteban then broke the door down, he strangled her, and then struck her on the side of the head. He then ran out of there and went who knows where, but Gina called the police. The police would arrive, and eventually they would locate and arrest Esteban. For some reason, he was only charged with a misdemeanor domestic violence assault and criminal mischief. I can't understand how it wasn't a felony, but Esteban would spend an entire week in jail until January 17th when he was released on bond. In court, a no-contact condition barred him from being able to see Gina while their case was pending. A few weeks would go by, and on February 16th of 2016, the police, I guess, were riding around and spotted Esteban at Gina's home, even though he wasn't supposed to be. Court documents would later reveal that these two never stopped seeing each other, and since the day he had gotten out of jail, he spent it with Gina. About a month later, on March 24th of 2016, Esteban entered a deferred sentencing agreement, and he was offered to attend a 12-week anger management course. He had to stay out of trouble for a year and pay fines and attend court. If he did all of these things, his charges would be dismissed in March of 2017. Esteban would never attend the anger management course, and staying out of trouble was definitely not going to happen. So for the rest of the year, Esteban was about to get worse and worse, and you're going to see that. It's important to note that in about January of 2016, Gina had gotten pregnant with Esteban's child, specifically a son. Several months later, in June of 2016, Esteban got hired as a patrol officer by a company called Signal 88 Security. On this job, he was a security guard in Anchorage from midnight to 8 a.m. and just made sure no one was doing anything bad. Esteban's coworker, James, said that he was always on time, professional, calm, and he took pride in the job. About a month later, in July of 2016, Esteban filled out an application to be an unarmed security guard in Alaska. This part confused me at first because he was hired in June, but I believe that there was a period where they could start working and they would just have to wait for their license. But also, Esteban lied on his forms about his mental state and prior charges. A month would go by though, and in August is when Esteban got a general discharge from the Alaska Army National Guard. After this, things would really go downhill. In September, I believe, is when Esteban and Gina had their child together, and Gina stated that this month, Esteban started saying he was hearing voices and things like that. Now this part is interesting because in October, on the 15th, police responded to another domestic violence complaint made by Gina involving Esteban. For some reason, they consulted prosecutors during this and got authorization to not arrest Esteban, somehow stating a lack of evidence. 6 days later, on October 21st, the police received another domestic violence call, and this one was by Gina to report that Esteban strangled her. Once again, somehow the APD must have dropped the ball here because Esteban was not arrested, with the reason being that there wasn't enough probable cause. A month after that, on November 7th, Esteban decided to go to the FBI field office in downtown Anchorage. He brought his infant son with him and a loaded handgun. He left the gun in the car, but he had a loaded magazine on him when he went into the FBI office. While there, Esteban started to tell the officers that his mind was being controlled by a U.S. intelligence agency and that he was having terroristic thoughts and that he believed ISIS was influencing him. Esteban appeared to be agitated, incoherent, and he made a lot of alarming statements. He told the agents that he didn't want to hurt anyone, and the FBI decided that Esteban was having a mental health crisis, and they contacted the Anchorage Police Department to deal with him. This same day, the APD learned that Esteban had a gun in his car, and they seized it for safekeeping. Esteban would then be taken to a psychiatric facility, and he only stayed there for 4 days. A couple of days after that, on November 15th, the owner of Signal 88, the security company Esteban worked for fired him because he didn't document his mental illness, and they believed his illness was affecting his judgment and reason, and this disqualified him. On November 17th, Esteban got a letter from the APD that told him his gun was still in evidence and that he could set up a pickup appointment. Esteban scheduled this for November 30th, and when that day came around, he went to the APD headquarters, but he wasn't allowed to obtain the gun. It's not explicitly stated why or what happened, but the APD called the FBI to meet Esteban there. 8 days after this, on December 8th, the APD returned the gun to Esteban. It was specifically a Walther PPS 9mm semi-automatic pistol. By late December, I believe, is when Esteban had come up with an evil plan. By this point, him and Gina had at least separated, and they were no longer living together. Esteban was living in a $30 per night Japanese sleeping pod in a hostel in Midtown Anchorage. The other residents there said that he was a paranoid loner and seen getting pizza real frequently. At some point in time, Esteban decided to pawn his computer, and I'll get more into that later. But then he decided that his plan was going to involve New York, and so he booked a one-way flight for December 31st of 2016, or New Year's Eve. However, for some reason, Esteban decided to cancel this trip and plan, and a couple of days later, on Tuesday, December 27th, he bought a one-way ticket from Anchorage to Fort Lauderdale for January 6th of 2017. About a week later, this day would come, and what Esteban would do was absolutely terrible. On January 5th of 2017, Esteban Santiago woke up with pure evil on his mind. This day, at 5:23 p.m., he checked into the Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport and declared a firearm. He took with him no other luggage. Esteban had a layover flight from Anchorage to Minneapolis, and this was scheduled to depart at 9:30 p.m. For 4 hours, he just stayed in the Anchorage airport doing who knows what. But eventually, he'd board his flight to Minneapolis, and early in the morning, they landed. This was a layover flight or a connecting flight to Fort Lauderdale. After some time, their plane would get there, and Esteban would board. Now, an interesting thing to note here is that during one of these flights, or both of them, Esteban was being disruptive, and specifically on one of them, he got into some sort of argument with someone. What it was about isn't known. The only thing that's known is that it happened. But at 12:15 p.m. on January 6th of 2017, this plane would arrive at Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. Esteban would then walk over to the Terminal 2 baggage claim and wait, and then Delta Airlines, the airline he flew, paged him over the intercom to go and pick up his firearm from their baggage service office. Esteban went to the office. He picked up his gun and then went back to the baggage area. A short bit after this, he went right to the men's bathroom and into a stall. Inside of there, he took the handgun out of the box, he loaded it with a magazine, put the gun into his waistband, and then exited the bathroom into the baggage claim area, and he also brought with him another magazine, loaded. At the time, there were literally hundreds to thousands of people at the airport, and at about 12:56 p.m., Esteban was walking down the Terminal 2 baggage area when he randomly pulled his gun out and started firing at people indiscriminately, purposefully aiming for their heads. Esteban emptied the magazine, reloaded, and then emptied the other magazine, firing a total of about 15 shots or so. At one point, he even went outside for a brief second and shot someone out there. Esteban would shoot and kill a total of 5 people and injure 6 others. Within a minute or so, a Broward Sheriff's deputy approached Esteban, and he dropped the gun and lied down on the floor. He didn't attempt to flee or fight, he just gave up. Esteban would be arrested immediately and then taken to be interrogated, where he admitted to the attack. He was turned over to the FBI because violence at an international airport is a federal crime. So some time would go by, and while in federal custody, Esteban underwent a psychiatric evaluation and was diagnosed with schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. He at first refused any medication, and this delayed proceedings, but later he would accept antipsychotic medication, and his condition began to improve. At first, the United States Department of Justice was seeking the death penalty, but in May of 2018, a plea deal was reached. If Esteban pled guilty to 11 counts of airport violence causing death and serious injury, prosecutors would drop the death penalty and grant him life in prison. On May 23rd of that year, he formally pled guilty in court, and on August 17th, he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences for each person he killed and 120 additional years for the injuries he caused. So why exactly did Esteban do this? Well, one thing that we have is that after all of this happened, Esteban told the FBI agents that he carried out the attack on behalf of ISIS. He told them that he was in jihadi chat rooms and other related chat rooms and websites talking to like-minded individuals planning attacks together. Esteban also told them that the government was controlling his mind. One thing to somewhat prove this is the fact that in 2007, Esteban created a MySpace account he deemed Ashik Hamad. On this page, it showed him in a Middle Eastern-style scarf and him pointing a pistol at the camera. This page was very supportive of Islamic jihadist aesthetics, and it had Islamic music and chants all over it. It was definitely Esteban's account, but there begs a lot of questions. The FBI would also go and seize the computer that Esteban pawned off and search it, and they said that they couldn't find anything to corroborate that he had any actual operational ISIS ties. Basically, that he wasn't in communication, being given actual orders or plots or anything like that. Now, this doesn't mean he wasn't in the chat rooms and doing that kind of stuff, because he was, but for some reason the FBI didn't see all of that as being actual definitive proof he was acting on behalf of ISIS. Regardless, Esteban will never get out of prison, and he murdered 5 innocent people on that day, and they deserve to be remembered. Michael John Ohm was 57 years old from Council Bluffs, Iowa. He owned his own land surveying business, and he was known as a hard worker who'd built his career himself. Him and his wife Carrie loved to travel, and they loved cruises, and Fort Lauderdale was just the gateway to another cruise that they were going on. Michael was a good guy, and he loved seeing the world with his wife, and on that day they were standing in the baggage claim together when Michael was killed and Carrie was shot in the shoulder and neck area, but she ended up surviving. Terry Andre was 62 years old, living in Virginia Beach, Virginia, but he was originally from Millville, New Jersey, where he graduated high school. Terry worked at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, and he served his community as a volunteer firefighter. He was remembered as someone who always showed up when others needed help. His neighbors and friends described Terry as the guy who loved golf and tennis. He did his own home projects like installing crown molding. He always loaned out his tools and helped neighbors with their repairs, and he was very a part of the community. Terry was also a husband and a father and a grandfather, and he was heading out on vacation with his wife for a cruise when he was killed in the baggage claim area. Mary Louise Amzabel was 69, and she was originally from Ohio, but in later life moved to Dover, Delaware with her husband. She had been married to her husband, Ed, for decades, about 45 years, and people who knew her remembered her as a warm, kind, positive person, someone who always smiled, remembered people's names, and made others feel seen. Her coworkers and friends recalled her as being a loving wife, mother, and sister, that Mary always had a smile on her face and always remembered others and their names, and that she was always upbeat and thoughtful with how she treated people. Mary and her husband Ed were traveling through Fort Lauderdale to start a cruise when the shooting happened. Her husband Ed was shot in the face and put into a coma, but he ended up surviving. Shirley Wells Timmons was 70 years old and from Ohio. Her and her husband Steve were grandparents who were very actively involved with family, community events, and this included activities at their local senior center. People around Shirley described her as a caring, family-oriented woman, a grandmother whose family talked about her with a lot of love and pride. Shirley and her husband had flown into Fort Lauderdale to meet some relatives to go on a cruise together, and in the baggage claim area, she was shot and killed. Her husband Steve was also shot and left in critical condition. Olga M. Woldering was 84 years old, and she was born in Suffolk, England, and later somehow ended up in Marietta, Georgia, with her husband Ralph. Olga was a great-grandmother, a grandmother, and a mother, and a huge part of church where she was active since the late 1970s. The church that she went to described Olga as being the life of the party and a bedrock member of their parish. Olga was joyful, energetic, and deeply devoted to both her faith and family. Olga and her husband Ralph had been married for about 65 years, and they were at the airport to start a cruise to celebrate his birthday when the shooting happened. Ralph was not physically injured himself, but he lost his wife. Rest in peace to all 5 people whose lives were taken on this brutal, brutal day.